Let us begin our journey not in the halls of power, but in the tranquil, rolling landscapes of the Hudson River Valley. Here, in the spring of 1882, in the grand but comfortable home called Springwood, Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered a world of privilege tempered by a profound sense of duty. The air carried the scent of pine and river mist, and the vast estate was a kingdom for a young boy's imagination. His father, James Roosevelt, was a gentleman of the old school, a man who believed in stewardship of the land and community. His mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, was a figure of immense will and devotion, shaping her only child's early world with a love that was both enveloping and exacting. This was the crucible of Franklin's character, a place where the values of noblesse oblige, the obligation of the fortunate to contribute to society, were not abstract ideals, but the very fabric of daily life. Lessons were learned not only from books, but from the rhythm of the seasons on the farm and the quiet conversations about civic responsibility that floated through the family parlor. The Hudson Valley itself was a silent tutor. From the broad, majestic river, young Franklin absorbed a sense of scale and movement, of commerce and connection. The towering trees on the estate, some of which he would later carefully catalogue, taught patience and permanence. He was a lively, curious child, often sailing toy boats in the ponds or collecting stamps under the lamplight, his beloved Scotty dog at his feet. Yet his childhood was also one of intense loneliness at times, lacking the rough-and-tumble companionship of siblings his own age. This solitude fostered a rich inner life and a reliance on his own observations, traits that would later manifest as a formidable, often inscrutable, self-containment. His parents, particularly his mother, sought to provide him with the finest education, first through private tutors within the walls of Springwood, ensuring his world was both expansive and meticulously curated. At the age of 14, this sheltered world widened with his enrollment at Groton School in Massachusetts. The transition was stark, from the sovereign of Springwood to a new boy in a rigid, Spartan institution founded on Episcopal principles of muscular Christianity and public service. Headmaster Endicott Peabody became one of the most influential figures in Roosevelt's life, preaching that from those to whom much is given, much is expected. Franklin, though never an athletic star or top scholar, absorbed this ethos deeply. He learned to navigate communities, to present a cheerful, optimistic face even when feeling an outsider, a social skill that would become a political superpower. Groton instilled the framework, but it was the river valley that provided the soul, a connection to the land and its people that he always referred to as home. His progression to Harvard College was a natural step for a young man of his class. Here, he thrived more socially, becoming editor of the prestigious Harvard Crimson newspaper. The work was demanding, requiring quick decisions, editorial judgment, and the management of a team, a microcosm of future executive responsibilities. He studied history and government, not with the piercing focus of a scholar, but with the practical eye of one who sensed he might one day use these lessons. It was at Harvard that the shadow of his distant cousin, President Theodore Roosevelt, loomed larger, providing a dynamic model of vigorous, progressive leadership that deeply inspired young Franklin. The energy of the White House now had a familial face, planting a seed of possibility that lay dormant for years. During these formative years, another profound influence entered his life: Eleanor Roosevelt, his shy, earnest fifth cousin once removed. Their courtship, often walked along the same Hudson Valley paths he knew as a boy, was a meeting of two branches of a storied family. They married in 1905, with President Theodore himself giving the bride away. The marriage would become one of history's most complex and consequential partnerships, evolving from conventional beginnings into a formidable political and humanitarian alliance. For now, it anchored Franklin further into the dense web of New York society and expectations, setting him on a presumed path to a dignified life of law and local stewardship, a modern version of his father's life. Yet, the lessons of the Hudson Valley were percolating within him. He observed the lives of the tenants on the Roosevelt land, the shopkeepers in Hyde Park, and the workers on the river barges. His world was one of gentry, but it was not insulated from the economic realities of others. This early, grounded understanding of interconnectedness between landowner and farmer, between river trade and local prosperity, would later inform his policies in ways abstract economic theories could not. The New Deal's agricultural programs and rural electrification projects carried the empathetic imprint of a man who knew what a working farm looked like, who understood that soil depletion was not just an economic statistic but a family crisis. Thus, the boy from the Hudson Valley was molded. He carried with him an unshakable confidence born of unconditional love and supreme privilege, a sense of duty honed by Peabody and his parents, a political sensibility awakened by his cousin's example, and a deeply physical, almost spiritual, connection to the American landscape. His optimism was not a naive Pollyannish trait, but a fundamental, almost feudal belief in the system that had nurtured him and which he felt compelled to sustain and improve. When future storms gathered, he would face them not with the frantic energy of a newcomer, but with the calm, patrician assurance of a man standing on his own land, looking out over a river that had seen centuries pass. The foundation was laid, solid and broad, upon which an astonishingly resilient character would be built. The story of Franklin Roosevelt's life contains a before and an after, and the dividing line is a place called Warm Springs, Georgia. The before was a man of soaring political promise, a handsome, athletic heir to a political name, serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and campaigning for the vice presidency. The after was something else entirely, a man physically transformed, yet spiritually and politically forged in fires of adversity he could never have anticipated. It began, of course, with the polio. In the summer of 1921, at his family's vacation home on Campobello Island, a sudden fever and paralysis overtook him. The diagnosis was infantile paralysis, a cruel misnomer for a man of 39. In an instant, the man who loved to sail, run, and climb was robbed of the use of his legs. The world, it seemed, had closed in. His initial struggle was private, grueling, and marked by a profound determination to walk again. He tried myriad therapies, from painful leg braces to swimming in the buoyant waters of the Atlantic. It was during this search for hope that a letter arrived, mentioning the healing properties of the naturally warm, mineral-rich springs in a small, sleepy Georgia town. In October 1924, Roosevelt made his first pilgrimage to Warm Springs, a journey of both desperation and hope. He arrived at a dilapidated resort, the Meriwether Inn, a far cry from the polished estates of his youth. But the water, maintained at a constant 88 degrees Fahrenheit, offered something miraculous, buoyancy and warmth that allowed movement without the crushing weight of braces. For hours each day, he would exercise in the pool, laughing and joking with other patients, a visible transformation coming over him. Here, he was not a pitted former politician, but simply Dr. Roosevelt, a fellow pilgrim in the shared struggle for recovery. The psychological liberation was as significant as the physical therapy. In the egalitarian waters of that pool, the last vestiges of any aristocratic aloofness washed away. He listened to the stories of farmers, clerks, and teachers, ordinary Americans grappling with not just a disease, but with the economic and social hardships that accompanied it. Warm Springs became his window into the soul of a nation far removed from the salons of New York and Washington. This connection was so profound that Roosevelt, with his characteristic vision and a substantial portion of his personal wealth, decided to buy the property. In 1927, he established the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation, turning a personal refuge into a beacon of hope for thousands. He poured his energy into every detail, designing new therapy buildings, planning hydrotherapy techniques, and even engineering a system of weighted pulleys for leg exercises. The foundation was run not on charity, but on a model of mutual help and rigorous, scientific therapy. It was, in microcosm, a New Deal for polio victims, a testament to collective effort, expert guidance, and unwavering optimism. Life at Warm Springs for Roosevelt settled into a deeply meaningful routine. His days were spent in therapy, but also in driving his custom-built, hand-controlled Ford Roadster along the red clay roads of Meriwether County. He would stop to chat with farmers on their porches, discussing crop prices, bank foreclosures, and the scourge of soil erosion. These were not political photo opportunities. They were genuine conversations that informed his understanding of the Great Depression's human toll long before he faced it as president. The Georgia dirt under his fingernails was as important a credential as any he would ever earn. The place also became a sanctuary for his spirit. At his small, modest cottage known as the Little White House, he could shed the performative strength required of him in public. Here, the pain and exhaustion were acknowledged in private. He found joy in simple pleasures, picnics on Pine Mountain, the company of close friends and caregivers like Missy LeHand, and the tangible progress of his patients. The struggle against polio had taught him monumental patience, the art of incremental victory, and a stamina for long, difficult campaigns. It refined his famous fireside chat manner, intimate, reassuring, and clear, for he had spent years practicing explaining complex things simply to fellow patients in the pool. When he left Warm Springs for the governorship of New York and, ultimately, the presidency, he did not leave it behind. He took it with him. The New Deal's ethos, that government could be a positive force for rehabilitation, that hope was a necessary component of recovery, that every citizen deserved a measure of security, was born in those therapeutic waters. The Civilian Conservation Corps boys planting trees were cousins to the patients rebuilding their muscles. The Social Security Act providing a floor for the elderly and infirm extended the philosophy of the foundation to a national scale. Warm Springs had taught him that a crisis, whether of the body or the body politic, required not panic, but steady, persistent, and empathetic action. Thus, the sanctuary was not an escape from his destiny, but the forge in which it was truly shaped. The man who returned to political life was not the same man who had left it. He was harder, wiser, more empathetic, and possessed of an iron will cloaked in effortless grace. The waters of Warm Springs did not restore the use of his legs, but they did something perhaps more powerful. They restored his connection to the fundamental struggles of humanity, and in doing so, equipped him to lead a nation through its own season of paralysis and recovery. He would return to the Little White House throughout his presidency, its quiet pines and warm waters forever serving as his touchstone to reality and the source of his unwavering, resilient light. As the 1920s drew to a close, the twilight hours at the New York State Executive Mansion in Albany were often spent in quiet, determined preparation. Franklin Roosevelt, elected governor in 1928, had returned to the political arena, not as the soaring figure of a decade prior, but as a seasoned leader tempered in a very personal fire. The mansion, a stately Victorian home overlooking the Hudson River, became both a family residence and the nerve center for what was, in essence, a dress rehearsal for the presidency. Here, with the nation teetering on the brink of the Great Depression, Roosevelt began to craft the tools of crisis governance, surrounded by a talented group of advisors who would later follow him to Washington, a brain trust in the making. His governorship began under the long shadow of the national economic collapse that followed the stock market crash of 1929. While President Herbert Hoover in Washington clung to theories of voluntary action and limited federal intervention, Roosevelt in Albany acted with energetic pragmatism. He saw the crisis not as an abstract financial failure, but as a human emergency. The twilight meetings in the mansion's library were filled with urgent discussions on a novel idea, that the state had a direct responsibility for the welfare of its citizens facing destitution. This was a radical shift from the hands-off philosophy that had dominated the previous decade. One of his first and most significant actions was the establishment of the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, TERA, in 1931. It was the first state-level agency of its kind in the nation, aimed at providing direct aid, work relief, and unemployment assistance. To lead it, Roosevelt appointed a dynamic young social worker named Harry Hopkins. The directive was simple and swift: feed the hungry and fast. Hopkins's famous line, "Hunger is not debatable," perfectly echoed the governor's own sense of urgency. Terra became a laboratory for federal relief programs like the Works Progress Administration and the Civil Works Administration, proving that government could act as an employer of last resort and a catalyst for public works. Beyond immediate relief, Roosevelt used the governorship to experiment with broader progressive reforms. He championed old-age pensions, labor protections, and conservation projects, particularly reforestation. He understood the power of modern communication, giving regular radio addresses to the people of New York, explaining complex policies in straightforward, conversational language. These fireside chats on a state level honed his unique ability to project calm and command through the airwaves, building a personal connection with listeners that transcended traditional political rhetoric. The microphone in the Albany mansion became as important a tool as the pen that signed legislation. The physical demands of the job were immense. The governor's mansion was not fully accessible, and Roosevelt's days were a marathon of movement, often requiring him to be carried upstairs or to lean heavily on the arm of an aide or one of his sons. Yet, he masked the immense effort with a dazzling smile and relentless focus. Public appearances were meticulously staged to emphasize his strength and vitality. He would be seated behind a desk before audiences entered, or would appear standing at a podium, gripping it firmly, his upper body projecting vigorous authority. The American public, for the most part, knew he had been ill, but few understood the daily reality of his paralysis. This performance of normalcy was itself a monumental act of political will. These years in Albany were also a time of personal evolution within his family. Eleanor Roosevelt, initially reluctant about her return to political life as the governor's wife, found her own voice and mission. She transformed the mansion into a place of constant activity, hosting gatherings for labor leaders, women's groups, and youth organizations. She traveled tirelessly across the state as his eyes and ears, investigating conditions in factories, hospitals, and prisons, and reporting back with unvarnished truth. The twilight hours sometimes included her detailed briefings, expanding his understanding of the state's needs. Their partnership, though emotionally complex, solidified into a formidable political alliance. As the national crisis deepened and the 1932 presidential election approached, the Albany mansion became the quiet campaign headquarters. Political leaders from across the country made the pilgrimage to see the man whose state was tackling the Depression with action, not just words. They found not a dogmatic ideologue, but a pragmatic experimenter, a confident leader surrounded by innovative thinkers, and a man whose personal trial had imbued him with a profound sense of timing and patience. He had proven that progressive government could work, that hope could be a policy, and that a leader could project strength from a position of perceived weakness. When he departed Albany for the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where he would accept the presidential nomination with a promise of a New Deal, he was not an untested hopeful. He was a seasoned executive who had already been governing through a national catastrophe. The policies, the personnel, and the philosophy had all been tested on the banks of the Hudson. The governor's mansion at twilight, with its lamps glowing against the gathering national darkness, had been the workshop where the blueprint for national recovery was first drawn. The lessons of compassion, experimentation, and communication learned there were ready to be applied to a waiting, wounded nation. Within the storied walls of the White House, the public day of President Franklin Roosevelt was a spectacle of energy and engagement, press conferences filled with witty banter, meetings with congressional leaders, and the ceremonial duties of the nation's chief executive. But the true weight of the presidency, the solitude of command, was born in the quiet hours. After the last dinner guest departed, after the aides and secretaries retired, the West Wing and the private quarters settled into a profound stillness. It was in these hushed moments, often stretching deep into the night, that Roosevelt did his most essential work, steering the nation through the twin cataclysms of economic collapse and global war. His study on the second floor of the residence, or the cluttered Oval Office after hours, became a sanctuary of thought. Here, the famous smile was relaxed, the public vibrancy replaced by a focused, sometimes weary intensity. He would often be found seated at his desk, the room illuminated by a single green-shaded lamp, casting a pool of light on the documents before him, cables from London and Moscow, production reports from Detroit shipyards, drafts of legislation, and intelligence summaries. The air was thick with cigarette smoke from his holder, a constant companion in these nocturnal vigils. The quiet was broken only by the turning of pages, the scratch of his pen, or the low murmur of a radio tuned to a news station. These hours were for synthesis. Roosevelt was a master of absorbing information from competing, often contradictory sources. He would read reports from his formal cabinet alongside personal letters from citizens and memos from trusted, informal advisors. He excelled at what he called coming to grips with a situation, holding complex problems in his mind, weighing options, and often letting solutions simmer until they crystallized. The famous Fireside chat scripts, which sounded so effortless and spontaneous, were painstakingly crafted in these sessions, each word weighed for its clarity and emotional resonance. He understood that in a crisis, a leader's primary tool is often not just policy, but the ability to explain and reassure. The physical constraints of his polio were never more present than in these private times. The effort of the day's performance, being lifted in and out of cars, standing locked in his braces for speeches, took a terrible toll. The quiet hours were when the pain and exhaustion could no longer be suppressed. He relied on his devoted personal valet, Arthur Prettyman, and his secretary, Marguerite Missy Luhand, for physical assistance and, just as importantly, for companionship. Missy, in particular, was often there late, taking dictation, managing his schedule, and providing a comforting, unjudgmental presence. The private man was vulnerable in a way the public figure never was. The nature of these nocturnal labors shifted dramatically after Pearl Harbor. The quiet hours became truly strategic, a time for wrestling with the monumental decisions of a world war. Maps covered the tables, marked with fleet movements and proposed invasion routes. He would study photographs from reconnaissance missions and decrypts from enemy communications. It was during these nights that he grappled with the logistics of Lend-Lease, the planning of the Normandy invasion, and the development of the atomic bomb. He maintained a direct, personal correspondence with Churchill and Stalin, their lengthy telegrams often arriving in the midnight hours, requiring immediate contemplation and response. The solitude of command now held the fate of millions in its balance. Yet, even amidst global war, he sought moments of simple respite to sustain his spirit. He might retreat to a small, cramped stamp collection room, where the meticulous sorting of tiny perforated rectangles from around the world provided a mental escape and a tactile connection to geography. Or he would host intimate, informal suppers in his study, children's hour, he called them, where stiff drinks were poured, gossip was shared, and the conversation was deliberately kept free of official business for a short while. These moments of laughter and camaraderie were not frivolous, they were essential maintenance for a soul under unbearable pressure. The White House, in these quiet hours, was not just a seat of power, but a keeper of profound secrets and lonely burdens. The cheerful voice that told the nation it had nothing to fear but fear itself was the same voice that, in the deep silence, murmured over casualty lists and reports of battlefield setbacks. The man who projected invincible optimism was also the man who stared out the window at the dark Washington sky, contemplating the unimaginable scale of destruction and the labyrinthine path to peace. It was in this duality, the public sun and the private shadow, that his leadership resided. The decisions forged in the White House's quiet hours reshaped the American century, born from a unique alchemy of aristocratic confidence, hard-won resilience, and a profound, solitary sense of duty that only deepened as the night wore on.